I get started right on time for our 1 o'clock session on borrowing costs. So I love this track. I love this topic. This is kind of one of the genesises, if that's a word, of am I not peeing into the microphone? Dan astutely said that earlier today. So in any event, we have two great papers, and we have a number of people that have been involved in the conference for a long time presenting. So that is great. We're going to start with a paper on refunding and refinancing, and then we're going to talk about the Dodd-Frank Act. One note, our second paper, the author Ruth Weinkauf is ill and not able to be here, so our own David Wessel is stepping in for that. I'll remind everybody we'll have minutes for the academic to talk about their research, then the discussant will spend 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions, and I guess we'll sit up here and do that. So Andy will come up first and discuss his paper, Savings Loss, the High Cost of Financing, which some of you may have read a little bit about in Bloomberg and the Bond Buyer, and then Caitlin Dwyer will come up and discuss it, and then we'll have a conversation about it, and then move on to the next paper. So come on up, Andy. It's 1:02, I think.
Years. Let me take a minute and explain the title, because it doesn't do justice to the too short, too long. But this is about refinancing to the call date. We're talking about refunding tax-exempt bonds. So that's the topic. You understand it? Some additional comments just to make sure it's a very simple story, but I'd like to make sure everybody understands what's going on here. Tom Doe earlier today mentioned it's about if the 5% bonds have been the standard bonds for institutional deals to be sold at a very high premium, because 5% is much higher than where rates have been. So first, to avoid the so-called de minimis problem, if you know what it is. But there's another point about these 5% bonds and all muni bonds. They're callable year 10. 5% is so high that all these 5% bonds are long gone. You could issue a 20-year, a 30-year bond. Today, you cannot find a single 5% bond which has been out for more than 10 years. They all have been called. And in fact, in 2017, advance refunded tax-exempt bonds prior to the call date. Then the tax-exempt refunding by 2017, because Congress eliminated that possibility. So there was the churning resulting from all these refundings for about a year. But then people figured out that the 5% coupon is so high that you could refund it. Taxable bonds. Taxable rates were lower than the tax-exempt rates. And so that's the topic we'll be discussing. In question, think about this, I won't tell you the answer. Who was the biggest beneficiary of these refundings of tax-exempt bonds by taxable bonds? Right. very brief. Here are the topics. I've already what happened in 17. And so between 18 and 21, there were at least 270 refunding of funds. Do here in this paper, we simply do what we call counterfactual analysis. This is the word I learned from my author. It simply means what would have happened had these issuers waited, and instead of refunding bonds prior to the call date, if just waited and then refunded when the bonds became callable. Show you results for 14 actions. Highlight. This is school building authorities bonds, because I spoke about that last year. Some of you may have heard of these. Very critical of that transaction at the time. We thought a counterfactual analysis just based on simple option valuation. It didn't seem to make a huge amount of sense. It seemed wasteful, but today we can look back, and that's what we do with hindsight. And then I'll show you the results for the other 14, and perhaps a few words about the policy implications. Just to give you some idea, here are the 10 largest things. And we total about 7 billion, I believe. Well, you can see it. All of them, because they did not become the paper, so we could only analyze counterfactual analysis only for those bonds which became callable. How do you do counterfactual analysis? I just want to mention some of the difficult. There's only one really complicated, technically complicated point that I will mention. Is the bonds that were issued, the taxable bonds, in some cases were not enough to fund the entire advance refunding. So we limited our amount that could be funded by tax-exempt bonds. I'll show you how that works for Massachusetts. 8 is just the taxable transaction. The discount rate is an interesting technical point. I don't know how many municipal issuers and analysts realize that the right discount rate for both taxable and tax-exempt bonds is the taxable rate, not the tax-exempt rate. Doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but people at the very least should realize that if you do something, do it right. Difficult. How many of you have seen an analysis based using taxable refunding rates? Now, the difficulty, technical difficulty, is that we're dealing with callable bonds. I think we have callable bonds, not the outstanding bond. It's taxable bonds that were issued, have a call feature. Issuers pay for that call feature, and the call feature has a value, and it should be included in the savings. That's one point. You look at the counterfactual analysis. What do? You look at the yield curve, but those yields are beyond year 10. Paul. So you have to realize that you're paying for the call and you have to adjust for it. So I won't get into any detail, but let me mention for the taxable bonds, we use the 20% volatility. I will not tell you about the Black-Karsinski model and so on, but it's just industry standard approach and volatility for the bonds, and 30% volatility for the tax-exempt bonds. Why? Because rates are in general, the lower should be the volatility. Measure performance, like a quote Calvin, he said, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. And unfortunately, municipal finance didn't do a lot of measurement, and that's the one thing we try to do in this paper. So one is, this is the key, savings lost. Getting a savings lost. What do I mean by this? How much more the issuers could have saved if they waited until the call date. Which could be actually a good thing to wait, but in this case, as you will see, they're pretty bad. The savings lost are big numbers. I came up with proficiency ratio, which is simply the ratio of how much they saved versus how much they could have saved. Idea. I like proficiency because it's efficiency, which I have been promoting refunding efficiency. So these are the two concepts that two measures that we use. The interest rates. Nobody knows where rates are going. This exhibit just shows what happened in the last few years. To the article in the Bloomberg where person for Massachusetts said, well, we don't know where rates are going to go and we don't have a crystal ball. This is the answer. We did it because we don't have we had some savings. Municipal issuers love to show savings. They show me savings, but they don't show option values. And they could have used option valuation to see that this transaction didn't look sensible at the time, but they did it in 2019. I'm talking about the Massachusetts transaction. So, obviously, when you any refunding for that matter, you think you're doing it because you think rates are going to go higher. That's the opportunity. And municipal issuers, particularly, I talk to treasurers, they always believe that rates will go higher when they refund. And what's interesting is that they just keep on issuing callable bonds. When they issue callable bonds, you basically think, I'm issuing it because I think rates are going to go lower. So they do this at the same time. On the one hand, they're very risk averse when it comes to refunding. On the other hand, they happily pay enormous amounts for the call option they buy on the new bonds. And I don't know how you can reconcile these things. So very briefly, this transaction I mentioned, the Massachusetts transaction, $115 million of taxable bonds were issued. You crunch the numbers, you find the 750 million was enough to refund only then 67 million of the outstanding 747 million. So you can't refund the whole, you can't fund the entire transaction using the taxable bonds. And then they showed, or we show, that they saved $121 million on this transaction back in 2019. Huge number. They were very proud. They put out press releases, spoke about this 121. Now keep in mind, when you issue 5% bonds, as they did here, difficult to show savings. You could refund them almost at the time you issue them and show savings. But talk about 5% NPV savings, and they say, look, we saved 18 or 19%. Wonderful. No big deal. The point is that when you do the counterfactual analysis, you find they could have saved 221 million. So they effectively, things lost in this case, 100 million, and this is gone. This is what the taxpayers will have to cough up. 100 million. The proficiency ratio, 55%. Saved is 55% of what they could have saved. All right. 14 transactions, 514. Of the 10 largest that I mentioned earlier, callable. So we had only 6 ones that we could analyze, six transactions, and then we selected 8 diversified transactions, smaller ones, just to have some sample. The total of this, as you can see, full amount was $5.7 million. That's the amount that was issued. And then these issuers are 14. The four largest are the interesting ones. California, the New York State, New York, the which mentioned these articles in the Bloomberg and by Martin Brown and in the bond buyer. The people responded and tried to explain the actions made sense, and they talk about this crystal ball. And I advise you, if you have a chance, read what they had to say about the transaction. Anyway, in total, we have 5.7 billion bonds that were issued, and all of these have become callable since. And so that you could do like this counterfactual analysis. And so here are the results. I will just focus on the two columns. If it's lost, the proficiency ratio. What you see is that just on these transactions, the actual savings loss was 577. 1% proficiency is where you break even. So I will, by first of all, showing you just a summary. 18% was the proficiency of the refunded bonds. If you waited, it would have been 29% savings. Loss was 577. Now, I asked, and this is important. I'll take a minute if I may. I asked my co-author, who is a professor, and I said, we need some grading system. I'm not. Would you come up with a grading system based on these proficiency scores? And this is what he came up with, and he gets full credit for this. Oh, by the way, you'll see that nobody got better than a C, and many of them failed. So this speaks for itself. Just to conclude, the answer would be to the people should know fixed income analytics to do these transactions. That would be a simple solution. The bigger problem is that how do these people get hired who make all these horrible decisions? And I am not going to get into this, but clearly, the people who made these decisions were not qualified. And I wonder about the issuers. I wonder about the advisors. How could these transactions take place? And money or exhibit I would like to show. Well, by the way, there are some attempts to restore advance refunding. You may see it in the web. The biggest proponents of America and the National Association of Bond Lawyers, they are the ones who want to restore this. One more thing I'd like to say. I have a bunch of references, and the one reference I would like to mention on bond calling a refunding, 1979. I co-authored it with somebody at Bell Labs when I was way back there, so long ago. It was used extensively. How do you use option-based just to decide when to refund? I don't even know about this today.
Sandy, note to self, don't take Marty's courses at UT. Doesn't grade on a curve. Bringing Kalen Dwyer up now to respond to this, and then when he's done, we'll all.
Good afternoon. My first time at this conference, so we're excited to be here. I'm sure that this Well, appreciate the opportunity, like I said, to be here and to speak about Andy's paper. Just had the chance of opportunity to meet Andy for the first time just moments ago. So happy to dive into the weeds on this one. So the paper is very much a commentary, I think, on how municipal government practitioners make decisions in the conditions of uncertainty. It's kind of a reflection of the bird in the hand framework or analysis, if you will. Specifically, how much is the bird in the bush worth? When you're doing refunding analysis, we know exactly how much, if we execute the refunding today, the bird in the hand is worth. We have no idea. Fancy math, we can prognosticate, we can estimate, we can assume things are going to change or not change, but we really have no idea what the bird in the bush or how many birds there will be in the bush making these decisions. So we've got to do the best we can. I like to say these decisions are made in the context of a bunch of maybes. Maybe interest rates will stay the same, or go up, maybe they'll go down. What's the worst that could happen? That you make the wrong decision. It's not like somebody's going to write a paper about it, right? And present it at a national conference. So keep that in mind. So no, but in all seriousness, in this particular instance, the authors are quantifying the cost of the borrower when they landed on the wrong side of maybe. Not necessarily at any fault of their own. That's just how it happened to play out within the window that we're looking at here. It just so happens, and I want to say there's no doubt to the analytics, I think, in the paper, having not in detail yet, it's just generally knowing the window, the period observed, knowing what rates did during that time. It makes sense that had borrowers waited to refund the bonds, in those particular instances, they would have in fact saved more money in the instance of Massachusetts, to the tune of $100 million. Here Andy's commentary with regard to discount rates in the industry convention to use tax exempt rates is very flawed. I agree with that. You're discounting cash flows. It certainly. It's important to note that some important context here, I think, that would help round out the analysis and the discussion. Rates didn't have to stay where they are or move down in the instances in which they did. In fact, not long after the window that we're talking about here, that's precisely what happened. Rates went up for the pace. So if you were to conduct this very same analysis at issuers with callable bonds outstanding in 2022, I should say 2022, 2023, or 2024, it's not executed a refunding. You would have seen the result would have been that they were either money and refunding savings, or that refunding savings, as in the case with a lot of folks, would just evaporate entirely. And so that's important here. In practice, a few other considerations are often at play when these decisions are made, and I think it's important. So the economic analysis, the fancy math, that's wonderful. Factor in determining, trying to make a decision. But others are policy considerations. It's issuers, when they're under the gun to make these decisions, have to consider their policies in place with regard to rules of thumb, which I really not agree with. In this instance, a policy calls for this consideration of executing an advance refunding with 5% savings. And then you present your city council, your board, an opportunity today to take on 18, 19, 20% savings, regardless of what interest rates do. And that was the case with the Massachusetts deal. They produced 18, 19, 20% savings, whatever the number is. They could have produced more, but they made the decision knowing what the bird in their hand looked like at the time. All of us, it's kind of hard to fault them when you take into consideration other factors that may have been at play. Budgetary constraints, for instance. Just making these decisions at the time. Other things that they're worried about. Budgets. Improvement programs on the horizon to the tunes of tens of hundreds of dollars. So if you presented with an opportunity to immediately save, say, $100 million. Reason that that's a pretty tempting opportunity. You're putting folks, a pretty serious burden on folks to make a decision. If I ignore that $100 million savings today and let the dice roll over the next couple of years. Or do I capture that bird in the hand and use that to plug holes in the budget today or to shore up funding that we know we need for streets, bridges, whatever. Currently, with projects on the horizon. So making decisions in that context, I would push back a little bit when saying folks aren't necessarily qualified or that decisions were dubious. I think it's important to realize that a lot of factors are in play here. Quickly, analysis could be turned on its head. It's important to note, just because, and just to the same point I was making a moment ago with regard to these comments with regard to qualifications and folks. Because an issuer ended up on the wrong side of maybe does not mean that they made a mistake, that they made the wrong decision in the context of that the decision-making process. That might very well be the case, but it's not innate just based on the outcome that we can see today. In some ways, with the paper, we're kind of congregating around on a Monday morning. After the head coach of your favorite football team made the decision to either go for two or kick the extra point, and he ended up on the wrong side of maybe. Hesitant, if we can try to, it's tempting to categorize that football coach in the idiot or genius category based on the results. But I think we need to try to take a thoughtful approach and realize that the factors are at play. Sometimes the results as they turn out won't necessarily. Because it turned out unfavorably based on bad decision. I think a few other things here as I was like said, there are more things to consider other than the fancy math, as I call it, and I don't mean that to be derogatory. I'm a fancy math man myself, so I get it. I'm all about the fancy math. I do think that folks, to the extent we can encourage folks, issuers, to engage as a much more common practice, independent municipal advisors. I am one, so I'm speaking as one. To engage these folks to serve as a fiduciary on their transactions, I think it would go a long way to forming the decision-making process. Too often, the industry still has transactions that are driven by investment banks who are underwriting the deals or perhaps encouraging folks to take a deal. At that, one thing folks can do is hire municipal advisors that serve specifically in their best interest. So, about 50 seconds left. I think I'll call it short there and we'll get to moderate.
There's a little picture of a mouth there speaking. You'll need to push to activate this little red light so that folks in the back and online can hear us. So just a couple of comments. Everything is on the record. This is a reminder. And all the presentations are on the web. Kalen, there's actually some great research on whether or not you should go for a 2-point conversion or kick the,
Absolutely,
extra point.
absolutely.
So there's some science around that as well. So before we open it for questions, I want to give Andy a chance to respond, and knowing that there's basic agreement on everything that's been discussed, I just please, if you want to respond to a couple of points that Kalen brought up, feel free to, but let's keep them brief so we can get some questions.
This one?
That guy right there.
Thanks, Kalen. Well, Kalen says, we don't know where interest rates are going. Nobody does. But there is something called option valuation. And municipal analysts don't know how to value options. Municipal bonds have more optionality than any other market sector. And you have people who don't know basic fixed income option valuation. And the option valuation is the substitute for the crystal ball and for the excuse that, oh, I didn't know where rates were going. But I presented last year, I didn't know what was based on analysis I did in 2019. I said, this transaction made no sense. 70% efficiency is unacceptable. Now, I've been talking about this for 10 years, 15 years. And I think now the only solution is to start doing these counterfactual studies for transactions which took place way back. We can go back 10, 15 years, thanks to Emma. We have all the data. And we can compute what I would like to call the Luby scores, the Luby grades. And let's see what those Luby grades look like. Let's see if anybody ever got a C or a B. I mean, when we look back, it's going to be pretty amazing to see how poor these transactions have been. Lori and I wrote a paper about this. Advanced refunding could make sense, but people are so anxious to show savings, the 5% savings. I will ask you, where did this 5% come from? It has no theoretical foundations at all. 3%, 5%. Look how great we are. We exceeded our 5%. You can exceed the 5% when you sell the issue. I was retained by a treasurer once from a very large city who said, Andy, I need you because we are just in a deal. And as soon as the ink dries on the deal, the bankers come to us and they promote the idea of immediately refunding and showing the 5% savings. And that's what we're against. And you just heard it.
Open it to questions now. We have a roaming mic, so if I could just ask you, wait for the mic and tell us who you are when you before you ask your question. Yeah, right there.
Jay Choi, University of Illinois. So I'm an academic, so I want to learn from you your point of view, Andrew. So you said the options are too expensive. So I want to know why that is the case. So I can think of politically the municipalities. Politically, the municipalities desperately want to have the ability, the flexibility to refinance in the future. Maybe that's one. The other might be these underwriters. They can line up the small municipalities with large big buyers. So that might be another. That's kind of the market power is on the side of underwriters. So what do you think are the reasons for this?
Overpriced. No, I didn't say that the option when you issue the bond is overpriced. I think the options are fairly priced, but there is something else I didn't have time to mention. It's part of the presentation. I just published a paper in the Journal of Fixed Income where I show that municipalities would be better off in an expected value sense by issuing optionless bonds. This has nothing to do with transaction costs. It has to do using the right discount rate, using the right analysis. I bet you nobody has seen this, and probably nobody will unless I'm invited to speak here next year. But tax-exempt bonds should be issued as optionless, not with a call option. The problem is that when the option is exercised, they exercise it too early. That's the problem.
And why? You must know why.
Yeah. Because they want to show savings, the 5% savings, the 3% savings. Look how much I'm saving. Saving without any reference ever to the forfeited option value. Nobody even knows, most people wouldn't even know what I'm talking about now. If they, the municipal treasurers, if I said, oh, you gave us too much option value, they said, well, what are you talking about? I don't see that option value. because you have to crunch some numbers and you need some analytics for it. And they do not do it. Most of them, I mean, some of them probably do it, but most of them don't. They don't value options, even though the municipal bonds have, every municipal bond is callable.
Caitlin, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so I don't know that I agree with that. So certainly not every issuer uses traditional option adjusted analytics. That's true. But it's very often the case, particularly with folks who have engaged a municipal advisor who's working in their best interest, to be presented by that municipal advisor sensitivity analysis or some form of option adjusted analysis that demonstrates the pros and cons of executing a refunding today versus waiting. Now, we happen to live in a world where interest rates prior to 2022 for 3 decades trended downward. And for that reason, when you do this counterfactual analysis, you're going to show that for the most part, folks would have been better off waiting. That's not the world we necessarily live in anymore. The paradigm has shifted. And if you were to update this very same analysis with issuers with call dates in late 2022, 2023, and 2024, what you'll see is that many folks are kicking themselves because they hadn't executed a taxable advance refunding and they would have saved a lot of money. And I think that's important context just generally when rounding out this analysis.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody, we have a reception tonight, so we can talk about this further during the reception. I think that'll be a great venue for that. Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca Olson from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Recently, Bloomberg has reported there's been a huge uptick in tendering of taxable bonds. They said it was a record, I think, of over $9 billion this year. And market participants are using the proceeds of tax exempt bonds to tender in their taxable bonds. So just wondering if you have any observations on that trend and whether if you're seeing any of the deals that you saw in your study now involved in those tenders. I know California and New York were a couple of the issuers.
People are desperately trying to cover their tracks. They don't want to have this out there. It's an embarrassment. They realize now with perfect hindsight that these were stupid decisions and they would like to have these eliminated. They're going to pay again a huge amount in transaction costs for these tenders, for the legal expenses, for the new underwritings and whatever. The churning goes on and on and on. And I hate to tell you this, but you keep on making these wonderful statements about we don't know where rates are going to go. I agree, but how do you know? And I don't think many people are sorry that they have not done these taxable refundings because they have lots of opportunities to do tax exempt bonds going forwards.
Yeah, but since those analysis would have been made, interest rates have risen 300 basis points or more. And so that eats into the savings. In fact, it evaporates savings in a lot of instances. There's no doubt about that.
Let me get one last question in here if I could.
Sure.
Gentleman there.
Yes,
And to remind us who you are.
David Erdman.
Dave Erdman from Baker Tilly Municipal Advisors. Comments here are more from my life as an issuer. Sitting in those trenches, making those decisions, doing a lot of advanced refunding transactions in my life.
Remind everybody who you were with, David, when you were an issuer. Yeah. Thank you.
Couple comments. First, sometimes issuers don't do refunding transactions just for economic reasons. You have a change in use, you have a bad indenture. So, you know, of all the transactions that were looked at, yeah, most of those could have been for economic reasons, but there could be some other factors out there that are away from economics that drive some advanced refunding transactions. So just want to highlight that. You know, the question about the 5% or the 3%, you know, a lot of those tests were developed based upon a market that we had in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. And, you know, Dr. Kalate, thanks for your ideas, because I think, you know, in my life now as municipal advisor, working with my clients to maybe update some of those bogeys, some of those tests, to take into consideration some of the things you talked about, reflecting both the things that you identified and also the current market are some things that we should probably, you know, incorporate into our tests going forward. As for tests, though, as an issuer, and as the discussion also mentioned, when you have policies in place and you're a debt manager and you hit certain bogeys, you know, we're paid to be debt managers, not speculators. And if we're at 18% savings and our policies say that we're supposed to refinance at 5%, yeah, there's a lot of reasons out there. Maybe we shouldn't do it, but you know, we'll be second guessed if, you know, if the rates would have gone up before now if they had gone up starting in 2018, 2019, and we had 16% savings, and then we didn't have 14 or 16% savings, as a debt manager, we'd be really challenged as to us having the smarts doing our job at that point.
May I just make
Yes.
one quick comment? Those 3% and 5% make some sense way back when bonds were issued at par. When you issue 5% bonds, they are complete nonsense. They have no bearing. How many people know that? How many people know? The second, there are obviously, as you mentioned, there are reasons for other than interest savings to do these transactions. I'm talking only about interest savings, because that's what's reported, and people proudly report these 80% MPV savings.
Okay, all right, great. Alan?
Alan.
Alan Garman, Maryland Transportation Authority. We had changed our debt policy some years ago to remove that arbitrary 3 to 5%. We identified it as basically a heuristic. It had no basis. And so we removed that and we substituted to look at option valuation. And so we've never done any advanced refundings. We recognize that with curve roll and rate volatility, even if rates rise, you're losing out on curve roll typically. Back when advanced refundings were permitted, you had negative arbitrage. Now with this year's doing taxable refinancings, you're refinancing tax exempt debt and taxable market. So again, you're missing out on a future tax exempt refinancing. So, we just generally view, I think many in the industry view advanced refundings as exchanging like small savings today for greater savings in the future. And I think, GFOA is a little bit remiss in that they still have that arbitrary 3 to 5% one of the policies. I try to work to get that changed, and at least we can, control our own policies. But we're looking at some refinancings currently and looking at the option valuation of, the gained option. So I think that's an important component. And in terms of the municipal industry, the advisory industry, they don't typically provide that information. It's something we have to ask for, and the underwriters don't give it voluntarily. So we're having to sort of insist on that kind of analysis, because otherwise, you're dealing in an industry where lots of policies have that 3 to 5%, and if nobody asks, they won't tell you. So, I'm hoping to see change in the industry where, it's adopted in policies and adopted in, GFOA mandates, so that we can, make better decisions. And I agree that we're not looking backward enough to see those refinancing transactions. And you mentioned that you have this long multi-decade period of falling rates, and that certainly helps the analysis of making those transactions look less optimal than they were. But you're also missing the curve roll, the negative arbitrage, and taking out tax exempt bonds with taxables. All of those things are going to favor probably waiting in most instances for either another recession to refinance or another low rate environment, or at least refinancing in tax exempt securities that are going to have lower yields.
Alan, thanks for making that point about yield curve roll, because I did notice that in your paper, Andy, and in the article that was published, the response from the issuer, but we don't have a crystal ball, but we do know if we issued the original bonds in a steep yield curve environment and we roll up the yield curve, we're likely going to be able to issue a lower TIC bond, even if interest rates haven't changed. And that seems to have been lost in both sides of the discussion that, wasn't. So that's a great point. And, again, a point for some more counterfactual research. So let's leave it at that. We're going to ask these two presenters to exit, and I'm going to invite David up. So all of you know David Wessel. David, thanks for once again hosting a wonderful conference and being our landlord for the next 2 days. Appreciate it. And particularly thank you for pinch hitting for Ruth, who is ill and unable to join us. So David, I'll give you the microphone, and then we'll have Lori Ranieri come and discuss the paper, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. You know, I'm not an economist, and I've often joked to Brookings, I'm not an economist, but after being here for 10 years, I could play one on TV. So now we're going to find out whether that's true. I'm sorry that Ruth can't be here. Ruth, for those of you who don't know, got her PhD at Indiana University in 2022. One of her dissertation advisors was Marty Luby. So this is the Marty Luby session of the Municipal Finance Conference. She's now an assistant professor at the book policy at Rutgers. And so what Ruth does is Dodd-Frank and say that the severe consequences of the global financial crisis prompted the federal government to make some sweeping reforms to the system of financial market regulation. And one of them was aimed at the municipal security markets. Firms and individuals who wish to do business by advising issuers of municipal securities came under the purview of the SEC. And she says that although the rulemaking process continued for several years after the adoption of Dodd-Frank, that by November 2010, advisors were required to register with the SEC and the MSRB and had federal fiduciary responsibility to the municipal issuer clients. And they knew at the time that the MSRB would be promulgating additional rules in the future. So the question she asked is, did the Dodd-Frank Act lower municipal interest costs by improving the quality of municipal advisory services? It seems to me one of her assumptions here is that by the SEC and the MSRB and having their oversight, that the municipal advisors would be either more responsible or some of the idiots would fall out of the market or something like that. And she argues basically that question is, what do municipal advisors do? And she offers three possibilities. One is they're a third-party certification. That is, nobody knows whether you can trust the school authority in some small town in the Midwest, but having a municipal underwriter as an independent person gives the investor more confidence. Secondly, in negotiated transactions, they monitor the underwriters. And third, they may actually give the municipality some technical expertise. We won't ask Andy to judge the quality of their technical expertise. Well, I think we know what you think. And she talks a little bit about municipal underwriters. And she points out that there's a problem in the muni market, that there's a lot of information problems. There's so many issuers, it's hard for investors, particularly, I assume, retail investors, to know what they're getting into. And she thinks that municipal advisor certification is more important for issuers that have low or no credit rating or have some reason that they have less security on their bonds. In the monitoring, she basically sees the MA as an agent to keep an eye on the investment bank or the other underwriter. Really true in negotiated sales. And third, she says that they provide some technical expertise on such things as refunding bonds, call features, and so forth. So what she does is look at this data from IPRIO municipal application. She has looks at all issuer types. She has 2 million observations from the period 2002 to 2018. And just to give you a preview, on the whole, her findings support the hypothesis that Dodd-Frank affected positively capabilities of municipal advisors, account savings for lower rated bonds, bonds that are not rated, and bonds backed by project revenue, all attributes considered to benefit more from third-party certification. She finds no evidence that Dodd-Frank affected the underwriting monitoring function of municipal advisors, and she finds mixed support that the technical expertise was important on bond issues considered to be more complex. But the bottom line is that the law worked as designed, that there's an average of 6 basis points savings by among all securities for bonds issued with a municipal advisor compared to what they would have been before the act was done. And to put an example on that, she gives this example, bond issue of $20 million par with a coupon of 5%, principal maturing in 20 years, 6 basis point reduction in yield results in a price of, $20.15 million, net present value savings of $150,000. A 19 basis point reduction in yield, she has a range, would result in a savings of $480,000. And referring to a question that was asked this morning, all right, but what do you have to pay for the MA? She has some California data, which says that the median municipal advisor fee in California between 2011 and 2018 was just under $38,000. It pays off. I'm not going to do a very good job at explaining her difference analysis, but basically she looks at the yields on bonds that were MA advised and bonds that were not MA advised before and after the Dodd-Frank Act passed. Here's her equation. I welcome you to read it at your leisure. She looks at some mechanisms from how certification can work. And this is a way for her to present her analysis. So if you look at the top there, the full sample, you can see that's the 6 basis points that she says savings. The line shows the confidence interval. And you can see that the savings are much greater. That is further to the left for triple B or worse rated bonds, revenue bonds versus GO. That seems to make some sense. Monitoring, she thinks that basically with negotiated, there's more role for the the municipal advisor to help get a better deal. And here she finds, you can see there that the negotiated dot is a little bit to the left of the confidence line. And finally, she looks at expertise and she finds that it's much more useful, much more valuable where they're doing advanced refunding rather than current refunding and slightly more with callable than others. And so what this chart shows, this is a summary of her work. Read this here. This is in descending order of the percentage change in average yield for the Frank with a municipal advisor versus after Dodd-Frank with a municipal advisor. The full sample results is presented in the middle. So essentially anything above it means that that set of bonds had a much greater percentage reduction in average yield than the full sample that is benefited more from the MA, and the ones below have less. And you can see the revenue bonds, no call feature, advanced refunding, they all have a greater thing. The stars in the convention mean that 3 stars is statistically significant at a 0.01 rate. So then she has this great example where she tries to put some meat on the bones. She says basically that the 2010 Dodd-Frank provisions reduced interest costs. It's hard to know exactly how they did that, but the strongest effects she finds are for the certification function, that is assuring investors that there's somebody looking over the shoulder of the issuer. There are mixed results for whether the expertise of the MA provides much, and there's not much effect from the monitoring of the underwriters. So I'll stop there. She's watching online. I'm looking forward to seeing if she grades, but I'm hoping she grades on a curve and not the way Marty grades. Thank you.
Thanks for pinch hitting, David. That was great. Why don't I invite Lori up now to provide her. And after a few minutes, we'll get back as a group and take some questions.
Hi, I'm Lori Ranieri. I don't know how to operate that. So can you hear me? Is it coming through the mic? Great. So that's Millie, my service dog. I'll also take questions later on service dogs. Emily should be glad to meet you if you'd like to meet her. If not, just give me the eyebrow wave and we'll go the other direction. Some people are allergic. So I'm Lori Ranieri. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Government Financial Services Joint Powers Authority. We're a California public agency. It says, I love this paper. Love it, but I still have some comments about it. So in terms of importance of research, what could be more important than looking into the effect of Dodd-Frank in terms of the muni market, which affects literally every person in this country. And I think sometimes we're getting very wonky at this conference. Every single person in this country lives in a school district. Person lives in a place that's governed, and when municipal finance isn't done well, it costs them money. It means they get less services, they pay more taxes. I take issue with David Wessel for one comment you made about, I think you said something about a small rural school district or something like that, not having expertise. My experience, and I've worked on over 1,000 public finance transactions in my career, the expertise of the local public officials has to do with who they are, not where they are, and not what kind of public agency they're in. And my joke is, I love a local school board with a butcher, a baker, and a candlestick maker on the board, or put better way, a farmer, the original experts in finance. Often those people ask the best questions and they do great with their financing. So I think it comes down to people and whether they have an interest in finance and they ask good questions and they understand data. And some do, and some people, it's a very small account of their job, or they're not interested and they just get what they get and they move on. And even the very biggest issuers in this country still don't do it very often. For very few people is it their full-time job if you're a public official. There's a few, but for most people, they're doing a lot of other things, so they don't have the same level of interest, knowledge, bandwidth, etc. Now, almost 3,000 people who are registered municipal advisors, and some went happily, and I'd say that most of us who were present during this transition would say they went a little grumpily to being registered, but now it's the truth, and this transition is great because it gives us that natural experiment. Now, the paradigm of this paper, as David talked about, focuses on the mere presence of municipal advisors and identifies these differences in yields. And then it takes from their presence to the certification. And I'm going to say, I don't think you actually have to go so far as certification. It may just be, and another person at the table causes everyone else to do things differently. And I think that's something that should be untangled, because I think some municipal advisors are more activist. Some are literally representing the underwriter at the table in practice, even though they have a fiduciary responsibility to the issuer. And that's another thing. We talk about issuers at this conference, because I've never met a public official who gets up every day and thinks of themselves as an issuer of bonds. They think of themselves as a manager, an executive, whatever they do in the public agency and in that community and given their mission. So this is just a small part of the way we think in this room. We can like say Dodd-Frank. I mean, I can tell you when I'm out walking my dog, if I said to somebody, have you ever heard of Dodd-Frank? I'm not getting a lot of, positive reaction, but in my opinion, it did affect everybody in this country. I think the national analysis is very appropriate for federal regulation. See future research that focuses how differently the effects have played out based on regional factors and geographic locations of issuers, but the combinations of public finance actors, governmental situations, economic conditions, among other factors. And to put it more simply, at least in California, we'll see groups of financial professionals, they have something they're selling and they go sell it in a lot of places. Might not be appropriate everyone, might be a good idea in one place, not a good idea in others, but they've created a team and they're selling it. And so you can actually, by looking at the people, you can figure out, what's happening there. And third-party reviews, I've had the exact same transaction in one place. I said it was affordable. In another case, I didn't. And the finance team are like, what's wrong with you? It's the same deal. And I'm like, but the different, different situations. It doesn't play in both places. And then the other thing is the economics and the geographic situations, or the type of issuer or type of public agency. They can have certain common problems. that cause certain things to play out a certain way at certain times. I like the difference approach. I love the magic of statistics, but it's one of those superpowers that really interesting things, but misused if you don't have the specifications right. And in order to have the specifications right, you have to know three-dimensionally what's actually happening on the ground. What you see on that big level, you can be seeing proxy things and not see what you want. Say in the paper, the way refundings were treated, I encourage another look, given another phenomenon that was in a paper called The Persistent Underwriter, was actually touched on by Andy Calaté earlier, which is, the consistent refundings becoming an annuity for bond underwriters. So they know that, and so they're pursuing that. So that, I think that data is a little bit differently, should be looked at a little differently. And of course, huge driver in the muni market in this period of time that was covered. As I said, I think the question about lowering yields is an excellent question. Paper as the start of research that I hope Professor Weinkopf and others will continue, because I think the most important questions relative to this particular area of research, the regulation of municipal advisors, agencies' financial condition and public missions are helped by municipal advisors, and to what extent. And to me, that has to do with total cost of capital. How much is on their balance sheet? How much flexibility have they preserved? Are they able to get done the public mission that they have better? You could actually have high yields and be doing better for various reasons of borrowing just when you needed, to fix that. Well, I'll give you an example. For California, we had a dam that was cracking and there was a flood risk, right? That at any cost, right? Because there was potential huge loss of life and loss of property. And then some of the prior research referenced is quite old and maybe factually out of date, and seem to have led some assumptions about market practices which don't comport with my experience. But that just leads me to why I'm so grateful for this conference, because we have this conference, we have more researchers working, so we don't have to just rely on a few handful of papers from 20 or 30 years ago. We can see more papers. And for those of you who are academics in the audience and you're thinking about what can I do that's new, I'm going to recommend you look at some of the old papers and see if you can show what's new about what everybody thinks was already settled, because the market is in a totally different place today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. I'm going to conclude. As I said, I'll be happy to answer service dog questions. Be happy to comment on the prior paper, which I also loved. And I think I'm going to sit in this chair. So I'll do that.
Thank you, Lori. Thanks, David. David, I don't know if you have a comment you want to make before we open
Yeah,
it.
Laura, I have a comment. What is the Government Financial Services Joint Powers Authority?
So several public agencies in California that were committed to best practices, guided by best practices like the ones that are shown here by our academic research, have banded together and formed a brand new public agency. And my team and I that were previously in the private sector, with the exception of one person who lives in Australia, can't actually be employed by a California public agency. The rest of us have all moved over to be part of Government Financial Services Joint Powers Authority. And we do public finance consulting, but lots of financial projects that public agencies need. I always say, if it doesn't require if it requires a spreadsheet and you don't need it every day, we might be able to help. So we do a lot of different projects, but we definitely work on capital finance.
So you advise, you don't issue bonds and you don't have any regulatory authority. You're advisor to the people who are doing all the borrowing?
Yes, but interestingly enough, when you bring up regulatory authority, sometimes we work for regulators. And in that sense, we might be doing an investigation or an analysis for a regulator that is using our work.
Yeah. Dan has a question.
Dan Garrett from Brookings School. Sorry. I really, of course, always love a good paper about municipal advisors. I was wondering if I could ask just a little bit about this history of who is using advisors between 2002 and 2008, particularly in the negotiated market where the kind of dip and dip growth was large. It coming from the negotiated kind of portion of the market. And so if I read of the SBC platinum data, the version data, is that less than 10% of negotiated issues in 2002 used advisors. By 2018, it's closer to 40%. So there's this really big change of advisors kind of entering the market at all for negotiating, or at least being listed on the official documents. And maybe they were being advised, just not listening. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about maybe this from Lori's experience. Who were those marginal negotiated deals who wound up getting the advisors who didn't used to get advisors? Do you think that kind of could affect any of the results?
That gets back to the presence, right? And using municipal advisors, at least in my experience in California, became very common where it was previously rare. And some of that actually, I'll credit the SEC with, because they put out some great documents that discuss conflict of interest. And I'm sure every municipal advisor that found those online printed them out and gave them to public agencies, right? So I think the awareness, many public agencies in California have adopted policies suggesting either that they would use a municipal advisor or when they would, when before. Well, first of all, we didn't have the term municipal advisor, and people didn't even, I mean, they didn't know. And I will say, if you ask a public official, and I'm talking about smart people who are paying attention, they will get confused if you say, who is your advisor? They'll point to the bond counsel. Who is your lawyer? They might point to the municipal advisor. And this is not to say that they're dumb or they can't get it. It's that this is, to us, this is big. To them, it's a small external thing that's happening over here. And it's not daily operations, right? And daily operations, they've got lives on the line. I mean, literally they do. And that's what they're concerned with. So I would say the rise of the municipal advisor, I felt that in my personal opinion, there was a legitimacy of independent, unbiased advice as a result of the regulation. Now, in reality, do I think that unbiased advice is the norm? I'm hoping and working towards that, and I want to promote that among all municipal advisors. But I think they struggle with the idea of fiduciary duty, because the hardest thing for everyone involved in a public finance transaction to consider is the idea of doing nothing. That's the first thing that often isn't considered. I say it's the first, it should always be considered, right? What if we do nothing? And the other is, what about alternatives? So I'll say in my third-party review work, I rarely see even municipal advisors with fiduciary duty who have been trained in fiduciary duty. There's actually no alternatives that I can find any evidence were considered. Now, maybe they were talked about, but I can't find if there was any written report. So I just think that it's still growing, this idea of what it is to be a fiduciary. And I think, you know, more years down the road, we'll see that recognition that that municipal advisor is supposed to be in that public official's shoes with their interests and perspectives. That's what fiduciary means, but they have to grow into taking that on. And I'll say one other thing on, because it relates to disclosure, is that not just in the public finance industry, investors, people in all aspects, but even in government, there's lots of people who don't know how to read financial statements. So just increasing the knowledge and comfort level with the topic will make things better, because then people will be able to talk about it and consider alternatives.
A question from Andy.
I was on the certification committee of the MSRB in 2010, and I made the point then that the certification requirements when it came to analytics of transactions were completely inadequate. I made this point to Lynette Hutchins, not Lynette Kelly. She agreed, everybody agreed, and they said, we're in a hurry, we have to comply with Congress, and we are going to upgrade the requirements. That was in 2010. To the best of my knowledge, nothing has happened since then. So the requirements today, when it comes to transaction analysis, are completely inadequate. I'm not saying that some municipal analysts don't know this stuff, but not because of the MSRB. I complained to the MSRB about this as recently as last year. They still haven't done anything. They said, well, it's up to the issuer to decide what they want to do, and nobody takes responsibility for these horrible transactions.
The clarification about the paper, though, I understood the certification as discussed in the paper was that the municipal advisor, it was based on a 1992 paper that talked about the municipal advisor providing certification to the pricing on the transaction.
I'm talking about.
Right. I just think that was a.
Yeah. We had a question here. How went in that third row?
Hi, good afternoon. This question is for Lori. My name is Vijay Kumar. I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University. I've done a little bit of work relating to financial advisors, but mainly, my question goes back to the unsavory perceptions that are out there concerning the role that underwriters play in the municipal bond market. I don't want to use the expression pay for play and all of that, but that's old history. But going forward, going back to what you said about it's not the lack of expertise, but it's the kind of people who manage these offerings at the state and local government level, or at the local government level. And more so, this is not a regular part of their job. So they don't consider themselves as debt issuers, but more as managers. In this context, I mean, clearly there's a lack of knowledge, even though they may be well-intentioned. The market is complex. So there's a lack of knowledge as to how to evaluate that offering at the time of issuance. And I hate regulation. At the same time, I'm wondering what's the best way in which, at the state and local level, it's a small amount, but I mean at a local level. But if you take the state of California, for example, it issues what? Literally trillions of dollars worth of debt. So shouldn't the state be concerned overall as to how do we educate these people? What kind of advice may be mandatory that the issuers have to follow in terms of issuing debt? What is your thought? Or what's the best way to do it as well?
Okay, so first, let me address, you brought up underwriters having an unsavory reputation. And I want to say there are absolutely outstanding underwriters that I know in California who do excellent work and are very straightforward about their interests and work very well at, with everybody involved. And I would say I think that for the most part, the pay to play issue has been dramatically reduced. Now, I am confident there are things I don't know about and that, would upset me if I did, but the rules are so clear now about not making contributions and forfeiting the right to do work. I think that's gone away. And I think most underwriters actually have embraced the MA role. Again, it was a hard process, and Rebecca's nodding her head, went through it. Dave Sanchez went through it. People were very uncomfortable, but they got more comfortable, and there's a lot of logic to it. And it also parallels the other things in finance where you have an investment advisor and money managers and all that. So I think everybody can work well together. And frankly, I like everybody being on the side of the table they're supposed to be on and not leaping over to sit next to me when they really should be on the other side, right? So we have to get that clear. Now, yes, who should govern what? But I think implicit in your question was who can we blame? And I don't know if that's what you're asking, but well, how can we help? And I'm going to say everybody is human. And so everybody involved except Millie here, she's our canine representative, but we have to allow people to be human. First of all, many people involved in making these decisions, they literally do not like math when they're reading a document. And I've actually tested this with people. Not anybody probably in this room, but people who, when they get to the numbers that are in the text or in the table, they skip to the text. So they can't even see the point that Andy made about your valuing options one way on the borrowing side on the initial borrowing and another on the refi, right? They don't even know that the numbers are in conflict because they're not looking at the numbers. They feel uncomfortable. So it's not just knowledge, it's comfort, it's standards, it's education, it's training. And yes, for sure, people are embarrassed if I know in my experience, if I do a third party review and said you had a $20 million bond election and your debt service was $30 million higher than it needed to be. You could have done exactly the same, borrowed the exact same amount, the same times, and paid $30 million back less than you did. That's embarrassing. But you know what? Embarrassing people, I don't think actually makes a good difference. It might make a difference, but I think it's much better to build from the bottom up, help people feel comfortable, make things straightforward. And, the statistical information that we provide in a paper here is not actually understandable by most people, right? I mean, you really have to understand statistics, that table you put up with all the, the output of the statistical analysis. So for those of us who are working in the public environment, we have to be able to translate why we should be doing something to accomplish the mission of the public agency. And we should do that with the highest ethics. And so I'm a big fan of the fiduciary responsibility because I think I'm clear on what that is. I hope I'm clear, but that's what we have to talk about. And also say the conversations in the public sector rarely are about ethics. So I'm going to finish with one comment. I was standing in front of a public agency, and when I finished my presentation, I was in front of a school board in a very sophisticated community, one of the wealthiest communities in the country. And nobody had any questions. And I said, as a certified fraud examiner, it kind of bothers me if I look at the record and I see that nobody asked a question. And so one of the board members said, well, what question should we ask? And I said, that's a perfect question to ask me, because I'm a fiduciary. So I have to tell you what I would ask if I were sitting in your shoes. And the first question I would ask is, who gets paid if we do this? And the board member said, I was thinking I should ask that. I said, go ahead. and she said, and I said, first of all, I do. Because if you decide not to do this, I'll put everything back in my bag and I'll leave. And if you decide to do this, I'll have more to do. So let's start there. But people are uncomfortable with that conversation in a public setting. So we have to make it okay and comfortable, and that it's okay to say, this is a page full of numbers. I can't read it. It's gibberish to me. Walk me through it. We have to make that okay. And we do that by the same human foibles that result in the problems. We do it by the human kindness and human support that we want to do things right. And it's also okay to differ about what is the right thing. It's okay. And we'll do the best we can, but let's at least bring up the question.
Thanks, Lori. We're going to leave that there. Great question, great discussion. Thanks to all the contributors. Thanks for your attention.
Well, we're going to resume in just a few minutes in the other room. So please join us there.